The Galactic Military Council chamber hummed with the low voices of various alien species, each one represented by their most elite warriors. The Galactic Commandos stood in the center of the room, boasting about their latest victories in a dozen systems. Their leader, a hulking figure with silver-hued skin and glowing eyes, grinned as he addressed the council. "We've seen what Earth soldiers can do," he sneered. "If you could even call them soldiers. They stumble around with outdated tech, lacking any understanding of real warfare. They're special forces? Primitive." Laughter rippled through the room, a cacophony of alien voices mocking humanity's place in the galaxy. Earth was a new player on the intergalactic stage, and most species viewed humans as a temporary curiosity, a weak, soft species lucky to have made it out of their solar system at all. The Galactic Commandos had earned their reputation by crushing every opponent they faced. They were the pinnacle of military perfection, engineered for war and bred for victory. To them, Earth's special forces were little more than an amusing distraction. But one figure in the back of the room didn't laugh. A human representative, face shadowed in the dim lighting, remained silent as the insults flew. His gaze remained steady, unmoved by the taunts. Finally, when the laughter died down, he stood. "Enough." The word cut through the room, silencing the crowd instantly. The figure stepped forward into the light. He wasn't a soldier, but he carried the authority of one. His eyes locked on the Commandos' leader. "You think Earth is weak? You think our soldiers are nothing compared to yours? I propose a test." The Commando leader's grin widened. "A test? Of what? Your planet's ability to lose? We've already seen what happens when humans face us. It's over before it even begins." "Then prove it," the human replied. "One of your elite commandos against one of our special forces operatives. No tech advantages, no backup. Just skill against skill." Murmurs spread through the chamber. The Galactic Commandos had never turned down a challenge, especially not one from a species as lowly as humans. The leader, now more amused than ever, leaned forward. "Are you serious? One of your fragile little soldiers against one of my men? This will be over in minutes." "Minutes?" the human countered, his voice cold and sharp. "I think you'll find it won't be that simple. I know the man we'll send." "And who's that? A soldier from your so-called elite unit? One of those SAS operatives you're so proud of?" "Yes. His name is Ghost." The room fell silent. While most of the galaxy scoffed at Earth's military, rumors had spread of certain human operatives who defied explanation. Ghost was one such figure. A shadow, a legend whispered about in the dark corners of alien battlefields. There were stories, unbelievable stories, of this operative taking down entire enemy squads alone, using tactics and instincts that seemed impossible for a mere human. Of course, none of the Galactic Commandos believed in these stories. They assumed they were nothing more than human propaganda. The commando leader waved a dismissive hand. "Ghost or not, your man will fall like the rest. I accept your challenge. But I'll make it interesting, I'll send my best." The tension in the room thickened as details were arranged. The duel would take place on a neutral planet, an unforgiving landscape that would test both participants' ability to survive and fight. The Galactic Commandos, still overconfident, viewed it as a formality. They had faced hundreds of species and won every time. One human, no matter his reputation, was just another body to be dealt with. As the council adjourned, the human representative remained for a moment, watching the commandos leave. He knew what was coming. Ghost wasn't like anything they had ever faced. And soon, they would find out. The transport ship carrying Ghost approached the neutral planet's surface with no fanfare, no noise, nothing to signal the arrival of Earth's most lethal asset. The planet, dense with jagged cliffs and covered in thick jungle, was an ideal place for this kind of test. Harsh, unforgiving, and filled with deadly wildlife. The perfect hunting ground. Ghost sat alone in the drop pod, his face concealed beneath his helmet, his breathing slow and steady. He had fought countless battles, survived environments worse than this one, and defeated enemies far more terrifying than the overconfident commandos he was about to face. Yet, none of that mattered now. This wasn't about experience. It wasn't about reputation. It was about sending a message to the galaxy. A message that Earth, despite its small place in the grand scheme of things, was not to be underestimated. The Commandos had arrived first, their massive dropship landing with a roar. They spread out quickly, their advanced tech scanning the landscape, mapping out every inch of the terrain. Drones flew overhead, relaying live data back to their command center. It was all routine for them. Just another mission where their superiority would be confirmed. Ghost, however, didn't rely on drones. He didn't need them. As soon as he touched the ground, he disappeared into the jungle, silent as a wraith. His mission was clear: outmaneuver, outthink, and outfight. While the Commandos relied on their tech, Ghost relied on something they couldn't understand: instinct. The Commandos, led by their captain, moved with precision, sweeping the area. They were confident, laughing among themselves as they discussed how quickly this human would fall. It was only a matter of time, they thought. But time was on Ghost's side, not theirs. Hours passed, and the Commandos grew frustrated. Their scanners showed nothing, no sign of movement, no indication of where their target was. The first sign of Ghost's presence was subtle: a drone malfunctioned, its circuitry fried by a silent EMP. Then another. The Commandos, annoyed, assumed it was a technical glitch, but the captain felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. Something was wrong. Before they could react, one of the soldiers dropped, a single dart embedded in his neck. The rest scrambled, but there was no target to shoot at. No enemy visible. Just the jungle, dense and silent. The captain's face hardened. This wasn't a technical problem. This was Ghost. The hunter had become the hunted. The jungle remained deathly quiet as the Galactic Commandos spread out, their advanced scanners desperately trying to pick up any sign of life. The tension among them grew. Their training told them to rely on the data, on the tech that had never failed them, but something was gnawing at their confidence. They had expected a quick hunt, but Ghost was toying with them, turning their own environment into a weapon. The captain barked orders, instructing his team to maintain formation, but the once confident Commandos were visibly shaken. Their technology, the same tech they had used to dominate battlefields across the galaxy, was now becoming a liability. Ghost had begun dismantling their advantage piece by piece, without even showing himself. Each time a scanner malfunctioned, each time a drone went dark, their nerves frayed a little more. Then, as if to remind them of his presence, another commando dropped without a sound. This time, it wasn't a dart, it was a simple trap, set with nothing but vines and sharp debris native to the planet. The commando hit the ground hard, immobilized but still breathing. His team rushed to his aid, but the trap's simplicity was the true insult. This was basic, primitive survival training. Yet Ghost had used it to disable a soldier from the most advanced unit in the galaxy. The Commandos began to realize that their tech was useless against a foe who didn't play by their rules. Their sensors and scanners couldn't detect Ghost, because he wasn't relying on tech. He was relying on instincts honed through years of training in Earth's special forces, training that taught him to use the environment, to blend in, to make himself invisible. The captain knew they were losing control. He ordered a regroup, trying to regain their composure, but Ghost's psychological warfare was already in full swing. Every rustle of leaves, every distant animal call was now a potential threat. The Commandos had gone from being the hunters to the hunted, and they could feel it. They were on edge, paranoid, their confidence cracking with every passing minute. Ghost, meanwhile, remained a phantom, moving silently through the jungle. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just fighting these Commandos physically. He was breaking them mentally. They were used to charging into battle, overwhelming their enemies with superior firepower and technology. But Ghost wasn't giving them that chance. Instead, he was turning the jungle into his ally, letting it swallow him whole while they floundered in its depths. The next strike came when they least expected it. One of the Commandos, panicked and on edge, fired his weapon into the trees, convinced he had seen movement. The plasma shot lit up the night for a brief second, but there was nothing there. The captain cursed under his breath, but it was too late. The shot had given away their position. Ghost struck fast, like a shadow in the dark. A single shot, fired from a silenced rifle, took out the squad's communication officer. The others immediately dropped into defensive positions, but it was already too late. Ghost had vanished again, leaving them scrambling to secure the fallen. The Commandos were starting to unravel. Their tech was failing them, their team was down 2 members, and they still hadn't even laid eyes on their target. The captain, gritting his teeth, called for backup from their dropship, requesting heavier firepower. This was no longer a simple challenge, it was a fight for survival. But Ghost had anticipated this. As the dropship deployed reinforcements, Ghost had already laid the groundwork for his next move. He knew the Commandos would rely on their tech, that they would call for more resources when things started going wrong. So, he had set his traps accordingly. The dropship's landing site, carefully chosen by the Commandos, was now a death trap. As soon as the reinforcements touched down, Ghost activated a series of improvised explosives, strategically placed around the area. The blast wasn't meant to kill, it was meant to confuse, to create chaos. The dropship was forced to retreat, and the reinforcements scattered, disoriented by the sudden attack. The captain's frustration boiled over. They had been promised a straightforward challenge, a duel between their best and Earth's best. But Ghost wasn't fighting fair, he wasn't playing by the same rules. He was using the very landscape against them, and there was nothing they could do to stop him. Another commando fell, this time to a precision strike from a distance. The soldier's helmet shattered, the shot so clean and efficient that the rest of the team barely registered what had happened before their comrade hit the ground. The captain ordered his men to fall back, trying to regroup, but they were now fully on the defensive. Ghost was dictating the pace of the fight, and they were merely reacting. The jungle, once a neutral ground, had become Ghost's playground. Every move the Commandos made was being tracked, anticipated. They tried to outflank him, to move with their advanced tactics, but Ghost was always 2 steps ahead. He knew their patterns, knew how they would respond, and used that knowledge to stay 1 move ahead at all times. The captain, once so full of bravado, now found himself questioning his own decisions. He had underestimated Ghost, underestimated humanity's special forces, and now his team was paying the price. They were the best in the galaxy, but against one man, a single SAS operative, they were falling apart. With every passing minute, Ghost tightened the noose. The Commandos were running out of options. Their tech was failing, their numbers were dwindling, and their morale was shattered. The jungle was no longer just a backdrop, it was an enemy, as much a part of Ghost's arsenal as his rifle. And yet, Ghost hadn't killed any of them. Not yet. He was proving a point, showing them that he could have ended this at any time. But he wanted them to know defeat. To feel it. To understand just how wrong they had been to mock Earth's special forces. The captain, finally realizing the gravity of their situation, gave the order to retreat. They needed to regroup, to rethink their strategy. But as they began to pull back, Ghost was already preparing his next strike. The Commandos might have thought they were retreating to safety, but in reality, they were retreating into a trap. The retreat was meant to give the Galactic Commandos a moment to regroup, but Ghost had anticipated this move. Every step they took deeper into the jungle brought them closer to the heart of his strategy. They hadn't realized yet, but they were being funneled into a choke point. The dense foliage grew tighter, the paths narrower, and their movements became restricted. The captain barked orders, his voice sharp, trying to keep the remaining team together, but their discipline was starting to falter. Ghost's relentless, invisible assault had sown doubt and fear among the Commandos. They had been trained for direct confrontations, for battles of overwhelming force, not this psychological war of attrition. Ghost waited, patient as ever, concealed in the shadows. He didn't need to rush, time was on his side. The Commandos' advanced equipment was turning into a burden in the thick, oppressive jungle. Their armor was heavy, their weapons cumbersome, and their tech, once so reliable, had been rendered ineffective by Ghost's sabotage. The very tools they relied on for superiority were now dragging them down. As they moved through the narrow passage, Ghost struck again. A well-placed shot shattered the visor of one of the commandos, the soldier dropping instantly, knocked unconscious but alive. The rest of the team immediately went on high alert, weapons raised, scanning the trees and the ground for any sign of their elusive target. But once again, there was nothing. Just silence. The captain cursed under his breath. Another man down, and they still hadn't seen Ghost, hadn't even gotten a glimpse of him. He was everywhere and nowhere at once, a constant presence lurking just beyond their reach. It was as if the jungle itself had come alive, working against them. The team moved faster now, more erratic, abandoning their previously tight formation in favor of speed. But speed wasn't their ally here. Ghost didn't need them to move slowly. He needed them to move recklessly, and that's exactly what they were doing. As they pushed forward, another trap sprang. This time, it wasn't a simple snare, it was a carefully constructed series of explosives, buried just beneath the jungle floor. The explosion wasn't large enough to kill, but the concussive force knocked the entire team off their feet, sending them sprawling into the dirt. Ghost watched from a distance, his expression unreadable beneath his helmet. He had timed the explosion perfectly, designed it to disorient, not destroy. He wanted them to keep moving, to feel the pressure mounting with every step. He wanted them to know that this wasn't just a fight, they were being hunted, and there was nothing they could do about it. The captain pulled himself to his feet, his ears ringing from the blast. He looked around at his team, now covered in dirt and debris, struggling to recover. His confidence, so strong at the start, was nearly shattered. He had never faced anything like this, never encountered an enemy who could make him feel this helpless. But there was no time for self-pity. He still had men to lead, and they were counting on him to get them out of this. But Ghost wasn't done yet. As the commandos regrouped, struggling to shake off the effects of the blast, he struck again. A flash bang, tossed silently into their midst, went off with a deafening bang and a blinding light. The commandos stumbled, disoriented, their vision and hearing temporarily disabled. In that moment of chaos, Ghost moved in. He didn't kill them. He didn't need to. Instead, he targeted their equipment using quick, precise strikes to disable their weapons and render their communications useless. By the time the commandos had recovered from the flashbang, their tech was crippled, and they were left with nothing but their basic survival instincts. The captain could barely contain his frustration. Everything they had relied on, everything that had made them the galaxy's most feared soldiers, had been stripped away. Ghost had reduced them to nothing more than men in armor, and without their tech, they were vulnerable, just as vulnerable as any other species Ghost had outwitted in the past. They had no choice now. The fight had turned from one of dominance to survival. The captain signaled for the team to fall back even further, away from the jungle, away from the traps and the tricks. They needed open ground, space to maneuver, somewhere they could level the playing field. But as they made their retreat, Ghost stayed close, moving like a shadow, tracking their every step. The commandos, once so sure of their victory, were now desperate to escape. They tried to use their remaining gear to call for extraction, to get their dropship to pull them out, but Ghost had already anticipated that as well. Their signals were jammed, their comms scrambled. They were completely isolated. The jungle opened up into a small clearing, and the commandos, thinking they had finally found a place to regroup, rushed in. But Ghost had planned for this too. The clearing was another trap, a perfect spot for him to finish what he had started. From the cover of the trees, Ghost fired again. This time, he hit the captain's weapon, shattering it into pieces. The captain's eyes widened in shock as the remains of his rifle fell to the ground. He looked up, scanning the tree-line for any sign of Ghost, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence of the jungle. The captain knew then, deep down, that the fight was over. They hadn't even seen Ghost, hadn't even had a chance to fight back. He had taken them apart piece by piece, methodically, without ever revealing himself. This wasn't a battle, it was a dismantling, and Ghost had done it with cold, calculated precision. The remaining commandos, their morale shattered, huddled together in the center of the clearing, unsure of what to do next. The captain, now weaponless and defeated, looked around at his men, knowing there was no way out. They had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and completely outclassed. Ghost didn't strike again. He didn't need to. He had already won. The commandos, beaten and broken, were no longer a threat. They had learned their lesson the hard way. Earth's special forces were not to be underestimated. The captain slumped to the ground, defeated. He had mocked Ghost, mocked Earth, and now he was paying the price. There was no honor in this defeat, no glory. Just the cold realization that, against someone like Ghost, they had never stood a chance. And with that, the jungle fell silent once more. The captain's breathing was heavy, labored as he crouched in the clearing. His once pristine armor was scratched and covered in dirt, but that was the least of his concerns. His weapon was gone, his comms useless, and his team scattered, disarmed, and demoralized. The reality of the situation had finally settled in. They weren't fighting an enemy they could overpower. They were being dismantled by one man, a human, no less. He cursed himself for underestimating Ghost, for thinking this would be an easy victory. But it wasn't just arrogance that had blinded him. It was their reliance on tech, their overconfidence in gadgets and superior firepower. Ghost had none of that. What he had was a mind that saw combat in a way no piece of equipment could replicate. He was using the jungle as a weapon, using their own fear against them, and the worst part was, they knew it. And still, there was nothing they could do. The remaining commandos were huddled together, instinctively turning to their captain for guidance. But he had no answers. Everything they had been trained to do had failed. There was no fallback plan for something like this. Ghost had turned their training into a liability, making their every move predictable. And as much as the captain hated to admit it, they were completely outmatched. In that moment, the captain knew what had to happen. He was no longer fighting to win, he was fighting to survive. Ghost had the upper hand in every conceivable way. The only option left was to retreat, to find a way off this planet, and live to fight another day. Pride was no longer a factor. Survival was. He signaled to the remnants of his squad, gesturing silently toward the edge of the clearing. There was no point in trying to fight Ghost here. The jungle belonged to him, and they were just intruders. If they had any hope of getting out alive, they needed to leave now, before Ghost decided to finish what he had started. The commandos moved cautiously, their every step filled with the weight of uncertainty. Each creak of the branches, each rustle of the underbrush, felt like Ghost's presence creeping closer. But he didn't strike. Not yet. It was as if he was allowing them this small reprieve, watching, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment. And that was what terrified them most, knowing he was out there, unseen, but always there. They reached the edge of the clearing and began to move deeper into the jungle, staying close together, weapons drawn, though they knew how futile it was. The captain stayed at the rear, eyes scanning the trees, fully aware that Ghost could be anywhere. His hands were steady, but inside, he was fraying. He had never experienced anything like this, being outplayed at every turn, knowing his enemy had the upper hand but not knowing when or where the next strike would come. Then, without warning, it happened. A series of traps, triggered in quick succession. The ground beneath the commandos erupted as hidden explosives sent shockwaves through the jungle floor. One of the commandos was knocked off his feet, his armor cracked from the impact. The others scrambled, but they were disoriented, confused. The jungle itself was fighting them now, and they had no idea where the next hit would land. The captain shouted for his men to scatter, to break formation and find cover. It was chaos. Their once tight discipline had completely unraveled. The commandos were running blind, trying to escape the unseen enemy that seemed to control everything around them. But Ghost wasn't just attacking randomly. Each explosion, each disorienting strike was part of a calculated plan to drive them into exactly the position he wanted. The captain felt the ground shift beneath his feet just as he realized what was happening. They weren't just being hunted, they were being corralled. Every move they made was being guided by Ghost's invisible hand, and before he could give the order to change course, they were funneled into another narrow path, completely exposed. And that's when Ghost struck. This time, he didn't use traps. He came in fast, silent, and lethal. Before the Commandos could react, Ghost was among them. His strikes were precise, targeting weak points in their armor with brutal efficiency. One by one, the Commandos fell, not dead, but incapacitated, each blow disabling their ability to fight without ending their lives. The captain barely had time to raise his weapon before Ghost was on him. In a blur of motion, Ghost disarmed him, knocking the rifle from his hands with a swift, practiced move. The captain stumbled back, but Ghost didn't press the attack. Instead, he stood there, silently, a faceless figure of total control. The captain stared at him, breathing hard, but Ghost didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Ghost had won. This was no longer a fight, it was a lesson. One that the captain would never forget. With his men down and his pride shattered, the captain knew there was no point in continuing. He had mocked Earth's special forces, assumed they were inferior. But Ghost had shown him, through cold, calculated precision, that Earth was far more dangerous than anyone in the galaxy had given it credit for. Ghost could have killed them all easily. But he hadn't. He had chosen to incapacitate, to prove that he was in complete control. And that was more terrifying than death. The captain, for the first time in his career, felt genuine fear. Ghost stepped back, disappearing into the shadows once more, leaving the captain alone with his thoughts, his defeat, and the shattered remnants of his once proud team. The jungle, now silent, seemed to close in around him, a constant reminder of his failure. The captain stood there, weaponless, his men scattered around him, their defeat complete. They had been bested not by superior firepower or technology, but by a human, a single SAS operative who had taken down the galaxy's finest without breaking a sweat. As the captain looked into the jungle, he knew that they had been lucky to survive at all. Ghost had let them live, but the scars of this defeat would never heal. The galaxy would hear of this, and the name Ghost would become legend. But for the captain, this wasn't just a story. It was a reminder, a brutal, inescapable reminder, that humans, though underestimated, were far more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. The jungle seemed to exhale, as if the tension that had filled every shadow, every inch of the clearing, finally released. The captain stood there, watching the remnants of his team struggle to regain their footing, their confidence shattered. He knew now that they had been allowed to live, not out of mercy, but because Ghost had something to prove. Ghost could have killed them all effortlessly, but that wasn't the message he wanted to send. Death would have been too simple. Ghost's real power lay in making them understand their own helplessness. The captain's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, slow, deliberate. Ghost stepped into view, his figure still obscured by his tactical gear, a silent specter in the aftermath of his victory. His movements were calm, controlled, as if everything had gone exactly as planned. He had no need to gloat, no need for theatrics. His presence alone was a statement. The captain's heart pounded, but he refused to show fear. He had lost, that much was clear, but he wasn't about to cower. He stood his ground, facing the man who had torn through his elite unit without breaking a sweat. Ghost's helmet reflected the dim light filtering through the trees, his face hidden but his intent unmistakable. This was the moment of reckoning. "You had us beat from the start, didn't you?" the captain said, his voice steady despite the weight of the situation. It wasn't a question. He already knew the answer. Ghost didn't respond, not verbally. He didn't need to. The captain knew the truth. Every step of this battle had been under Ghost's control. The traps, the sabotage, the psychological warfare, it had all been part of a larger strategy, one that the Galactic Commandos had never stood a chance against. They had relied on their superior technology, on their reputation as the galaxy's finest, and Ghost had turned that against them with ruthless precision. The captain looked around at the fallen Commandos, each one alive but incapacitated, their pride wounded far deeper than their bodies. He realized that this defeat wasn't just physical. It was existential. Everything they believed in, their training, their tech, their supposed invincibility, had been shattered by one man, operating alone, without any of the advantages they had taken for granted. "We underestimated you," the captain admitted. It was the only truth left to say. We thought we were invincible." Ghost remained silent, but his body language conveyed what needed to be understood. Underestimation was exactly what had doomed them. Earth had been mocked and dismissed for its seemingly primitive soldiers, its lack of advanced weaponry compared to the rest of the galaxy. But Ghost had shown that strength wasn't just about technology. It was about adaptability, cunning, and a relentless will to win. The captain felt a bitter taste in his mouth as he thought about how easily they had been played. From the moment they had set foot on this planet, Ghost had been 3 steps ahead. The traps, the diversions, the psychological pressure, it had all been designed to dismantle their confidence, to turn their strengths into weaknesses. Ghost finally moved, just a slight shift, as if he were preparing to leave. The captain knew that this was his final chance to salvage something from this disaster. He couldn't allow his team's humiliation to be the only legacy of this encounter. He needed to understand, to take something back with him that could explain how they had been outplayed so thoroughly. "How?" the captain asked, his voice low. "How did you do it?" For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Then Ghost spoke, his voice distorted slightly through his helmet's modulator, but clear enough to cut through the captain's confusion. "We survive." That was it. 2 words. Simple, direct, but they carried the weight of Earth's resilience. The captain understood immediately. It wasn't about gadgets or tech. It wasn't about superior firepower or overwhelming numbers. It was about survival. Ghost and the soldiers like him had been trained in environments where failure wasn't an option, where survival was the only goal. They adapted, they endured, and they thrived in conditions that others would find unbearable. Ghost had taken that principle, survival above all, and turned it into a weapon. The Galactic Commandos had expected a fair fight, one where their superior gear and tactics would win the day. But Ghost had never intended to fight on their terms. He had made them play his game, and in doing so, had stripped away all their advantages. The captain took a deep breath, realizing that there was no way to win against that kind of mindset. They could have had all the tech in the universe, but it wouldn't have mattered. Ghost had fought with something far more dangerous: patience, adaptability, and the willingness to endure whatever it took to succeed. The captain had been fighting a war of attrition without even knowing it, and by the time he realized, it was too late. Ghost turned and began to walk away, his mission complete. The captain watched him go, knowing that the story of this encounter would spread far and wide. The galaxy would hear about how the Galactic Commandos, the most elite force in existence, had been brought to their knees by a single human operative. The captain couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Earth, once underestimated and mocked, would now be seen in a new light. And Ghost had made sure of that. As Ghost disappeared into the jungle, the captain knew he and his team would be picked up soon. They would return to their ships, their egos bruised, their confidence shaken, but alive. And in the end, that was the only victory they could claim: they had survived. But it wasn't because of their skill. It was because Ghost had allowed them to. The captain sat down, exhaustion washing over him. His men would recover physically, but the psychological scars would remain. They had been shown what true resilience looked like, and it wasn't something that could be replicated with technology or brute strength. It was something far deeper, something that Ghost embodied perfectly. And as the captain sat in silence, waiting for extraction, he couldn't help but wonder just how many more like Ghost Earth had in reserve. The thought was chilling.